The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, Orville Granger wished he had never opened it. He had been sitting in the cramped back office of the Meridian Land and Cattle Company in Denver, Colorado, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold and watching rain streak down the window glass, when his employer, a barrel-chested man named Harlan Voss, had dropped the envelope on his desk with the weight of a verdict. "I need you to go to Callow Creek," Voss had said, pulling at his suspenders with both thumbs, the way he always did when he was about to ask something he knew was unreasonable. "There is a woman out there stirring up trouble among the homesteaders. She has got half the valley convinced that our purchase agreements are fraudulent, and the other half she is working on. I need you to go in, talk sense into the lot of them, get the signatures we are owed, and put this matter to rest." What kind of woman? Orville had asked, which in retrospect was entirely the wrong question. "A widow," Voss had said. "Name of Underwood, Mamie Underwood. Her husband died 2 winters ago. Some kind of fever left her the homestead and a couple of children, and apparently more backbone than any woman in the territory has a right to possess. She has been making speeches, organizing meetings in her barn, sending letters to the territorial governor." Voss had paused and looked at Orville the way a man looks at a tool he is about to put to hard use. "She is making my investors nervous, Granger, and nervous investors stop writing checks, so I need you to go stop her." Orville had taken the job because he always took the job. That was the simple truth of who he was in the autumn of 1884. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and lean from years of riding, with dark hair that curled at his collar and gray eyes that people often described as quiet. He was good at negotiating land contracts, good at smoothing over disputes, good at saying the right words in the right tone to make a man feel he was being treated fairly even when the arithmetic said otherwise. He had told himself for 3 years that this was legitimate work. He told himself that again on the morning he packed his saddlebag and rode south out of Denver toward the San Luis Valley, through the long autumn gold of the cottonwood trees, toward a place called Callow Creek. The valley opened up before him on the afternoon of his second day of riding, and even in his current mood, something in Orville's chest went still at the sight of it. The San Luis Valley in that season was a thing of extravagant beauty. The mountains rose on either side like the walls of a cathedral, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of October, and between them lay a sweep of grassland and farmland so wide and so various in color, amber and rust and deep green where the irrigation ditches ran, that it seemed painted rather than real. The Rio Grande curled through the middle of it, silver bright in the afternoon sun, and on either bank there were homesteads, small and square and serious, with their vegetable gardens put to bed for winter and their livestock penned neat behind split-rail fences. Callow Creek itself was a town of perhaps 300 souls, built along a single main street with the modest confidence of a community that expected to survive. There was a general store, a blacksmith's, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a small hotel called the Drover's Rest, and a saloon called, without any apparent irony, the Steady Hand. Orville rode down the main street slowly, aware of the eyes that followed him, and tied his horse outside the hotel. The woman at the front desk looked him over the way the people of small towns always looked at strangers, with a complete and thorough assessment that they performed entirely behind a pleasant expression. "Just passing through." She asked. "Business," Orville said. "I will need a room for a week, possibly 2. The woman's pleasant expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. "You would not be one of Voss's men, would you?" Orville had learned long ago that lying in the first 5 minutes in a small town was the fastest road to ruin. "I work for Meridian Land and Cattle," he said. "My name is Orville Granger." The woman at the desk, whose name he later learned was Clara Hofstadter, gave him a room on the 2nd floor and charged him double what the posted rate said. And Orville paid it without comment because he understood that this was entirely fair. He spent his first evening in Callow Creek walking the town, listening more than talking. He had a gift for this, for sitting at the edge of a conversation at the counter of a general store, or standing near enough to a group of men outside the blacksmith's to hear what was being said without being part of it. What he heard, piece by piece, over the course of that first evening, was a story that did not match the one Harlan Voss had told him. The Meridian Land and Cattle Company had, according to Voss, legally purchased options on several thousand acres of valley land that the homesteaders had signed over willingly in exchange for fair payment. The homesteaders, according to everyone in Callow Creek who was willing to speak about it, had signed papers they had been told were mortgage restructuring agreements during a particularly brutal drought 2 years prior, when several families had been desperate enough to sign almost anything a man in a good suit put in front of them. The papers had, in fact, been land sale options at dramatically below market value, with terms written in legal language dense enough to be impenetrable to anyone without formal education. Mamie Underwood, the story went, had been the first one to have the papers read to her by a lawyer, a man who had ridden up from a limosa after she had written him a 3-page letter describing her situation. The lawyer had told her what the documents actually said, and Mamie Underwood had done what, apparently, Mamie Underwood always did. She had gotten to work. She had gone to every family in the valley that held one of these papers. She had organized a meeting in her barn. She had written letters not only to the territorial governor, but to the Denver newspapers and to 2 separate members of the United States Congress. She had convinced 14 families to formally contest the validity of their agreements on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation, and she had done all of this in the 12 months since her husband, Thomas Underwood, had died of typhoid fever in the February of 1883, leaving her with a working homestead, 2 children, a team of horses, and a character so formidable that even the people of the valley who were afraid of Voss were more afraid of disappointing her. Orville went to sleep that night in his room at the Drover's Rest, feeling the particular discomfort of a man who is beginning to understand that he has been standing on the wrong side of something. He was up before dawn, dressed and out the door before Clara Hofstadter had started the breakfast coffee, and he rode south out of town on the road that led toward the Underwood homestead. He told himself he was going to assess the situation. He told himself he was going to do his job. He was only partially listening to himself. The Underwood homestead was 1.5 miles south of town, set back from the road behind a stand of cottonwood trees, whose leaves had gone a shade of yellow so pure it looked almost white in the early morning light. The house was a good-sized adobe structure, solid and well-kept, with a covered porch along the front and flower boxes under the windows that still held the dried stalks of what had been summer flowers. There was a barn to the left, larger than he expected, and beyond it a kitchen garden and then a field of winter wheat, already showing green in long, careful rows. Behind the barn he could see the chicken yard, and a milk cow stood placidly in a small pen beside it. A person was splitting wood in the yard between the house and the barn. Orville pulled his horse up at the gate and sat for a moment watching, because the person splitting wood was doing it with a kind of focused efficiency that was almost beautiful to watch. The lift, the set, the clean downswing, the split, the toss. Every motion was economical and sure. Not until the person turned to reach for another log did he realize he was watching a woman. She was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a man's felt hat that she was clearly wearing because it was practical rather than fashionable. She had a strong, fine-boned face that was currently flushed from exertion, and she was wearing a work dress of dark blue wool under a canvas barn coat that had seen a great deal of use. When she straightened and saw him at the gate, she set her axe against the chopping block with a deliberateness that told him she was not particularly surprised to see a stranger, and she looked at him with a calm, appraising intelligence that he found immediately unsettling. "Mr. Granger," she said. It was not a question. That stopped him. He had not expected to be known. He swung down from the saddle and removed his hat. "Ma'am, You have me at a disadvantage." "Clara Hofstadter sent word," she said, and something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile. "It is a small town. You are welcome to tie your horse at the post there." She nodded toward a hitching post near the porch. "I will put coffee on." He had expected hostility. He had, if he was honest, half hoped for it, because hostility was easier to navigate than what he was getting, which was a kind of matter-of-fact composure that made him feel, at 31 years old and in his good riding coat, like he had arrived unprepared for something important. He tied his horse and followed her onto the porch and into the front room of the house, which was warm from a fire already burning in the stone hearth, and which smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something sweet baking. There were books on a shelf along one wall, more books than he had seen in any homestead house in his experience, and on the table near the window there were papers spread out, covered in neat, careful handwriting. A rifle stood in the corner by the door, well-oiled and ready, which in this territory was unremarkable. From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of children, a boy's voice and then a girl's, engaged in some dispute that resolved itself before either of them emerged. Mamie Underwood went to the stove and began making coffee with the same efficient economy with which she had split wood, and Orville stood in the middle of the room and felt the peculiar sensation of being somewhere he had not expected to feel at home. "Sit down," she said without turning around. "You are making the room feel crowded." He sat. She brought 2 cups of coffee to the table and sat across from him, and she folded her hands on the papers and looked at him with those clear, direct eyes. They were brown, he noticed now, with a warmth in them that her composure almost concealed. "I know why you are here," she said. "Then I will not waste your time pretending otherwise," he said. "Harlan Voss sent me. He wants me to speak with the families holding contested agreements and to resolve the situation." "Resolve it in his favor," she said. "That is what he would like." "And what would you like, Mr. Granger?" It was such a direct question that Orville found himself without an immediate answer, which was a sensation he was not accustomed to. "I would like to understand the situation fully," he said finally. "Then you already know more than the last man Voss sent," she said. He did not ask that question at all. She unfolded her hands and picked up her coffee cup. "The last man told the Bauer family that if they did not honor their agreement, Voss would call in their existing bank loan and they would lose everything. The Bauers have 5 children. The youngest is 7 months old." She said this quietly, without heat, which made it land harder than anger would have. Orville looked down at his coffee cup. The ceramic was chipped along the rim in 2 places, and the coffee inside was strong and dark and very good. "Who was the last man?" he asked. "I do not know his name. He left after I organized the second meeting." She paused. "I should tell you that there will be a 3rd meeting on Saturday, at this barn. I have spoken to a lawyer in Alamosa, and we are formally contesting 6 of the agreements on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. The other 8 families are considering joining the contest, and I have received a reply from Congressman Morrison's office indicating that he is interested in the matter." Orville studied her face across the table. She was not threatening him. She was informing him, with the straightforward precision of a general describing her field positions. He understood suddenly that this was a woman who had decided, somewhere in the depths of whatever grief she had carried since her husband's death, that she was not going to be afraid of anyone, and that the decision had become so settled in her that it did not require any effort to maintain. It was simply who she was now. "Mrs. Underwood," he said slowly, "I am going to ask you to show me the contested agreements, all of them." She looked at him steadily for a long moment. "Why?" "Because I want to read them," he said. "Because I need to understand what I am actually dealing with before I do anything at all." Something in her expression shifted, not much, but enough for him to notice. She reached across the table and pulled a leather folder from beneath the stack of papers, and she opened it and laid the documents in front of him. He read them. He read them carefully, the way he had been trained to read legal documents, following the language through its coils and subclauses and conditional provisions. And as he read, the discomfort he had felt the night before solidified into something harder and colder in his chest. The agreements were, from a strictly technical standpoint, signed by the homesteaders. They were legally binding on their face. But the language describing what the homesteaders were actually agreeing to had been buried in the fourth and fifth pages of six-page documents, written in a font smaller than the rest, and structured in such a way that anyone reading through would naturally assume they had reached the boilerplate section. The price per acre, when you found it and calculated it, was 40% below the current valley land value. The option period gave Voss 3 years to exercise purchase at that price, during which time the homesteaders could not sell to anyone else. And there was a clause on the final page that allowed Voss to call in a penalty payment of $500 per parcel if the homesteader attempted to contest the validity of the agreement in court. He set the documents down. He was quiet for a moment. "How many people signed these?" he asked. 14 families initially," Mamie said. "During the drought 2 summers ago, when Voss's men came through with the papers and the promise of immediate cash payments, the cash payments were real. $500 per family, which felt like salvation in that season. It was only later, when families began receiving notices that Voss intended to exercise his purchase options, that people understood what they had signed." She paused. "My husband signed our agreement 3 days before he fell ill. He did not have time to understand what it meant. I found the notice from Voss's company in the correspondence 6 months after Thomas died, when I was settling the estate." Orville looked at her. He could see, very briefly, the shadow of what it had cost her to find that, the grief already enormous and then this, landing on top of it. But she had straightened her spine and picked up the axe and gotten to work. Of course she had. "I cannot tell you that I can help you," he said carefully. "What I can tell you is that I am going to think very hard about this before I do anything at all." "That is more than I expected," she said, and this time the thing at the corner of her mouth was unmistakably a small smile. It changed her face in a way that was difficult to look away from. He rode back to town that morning in a state of turbulent thought that his horse, a sensible gray mare named Pilot, seemed to share, because she kept flicking her ears and tossing her head as if she too were working something out. He did not write to Voss that day. He went instead to the office of a local man named Cephas Webb, who served as both the justice of the peace and the closest thing Callow Creek had to a local attorney, and he asked Cephas Webb very carefully worded questions about property law in the Colorado Territory, about the standards for fraudulent misrepresentation in contract law, and about the current land values in the San Luis Valley. Cephas Webb, who was a small, dry-voiced man of about 60 with an extraordinary memory for legal precedent, answered every question precisely, and watched Orville the whole time with the bright, patient eyes of a man who already knew where the conversation was going. "You are not the first fellow from Voss's outfit to come in here asking questions," Cephas Webb said when Orville was done, "but you are the first one who asked the right ones." Orville went back to the hotel and sat on his bed with his boots still on and stared at the ceiling for a long time. By Saturday, he had not written to Voss. He had ridden out to visit 3 of the other families holding contested agreements. The Bowers, a German family with a homestead along the western edge of the valley. The Domings family, whose great-grandfather had farmed the valley before Colorado was even a territory. And a young couple named Pete and Ruthann Alton, who had been married only 2 years, and whose agreement was the most recent of the lot, signed in the last month of the drought. He had talked to all of them and listened to all of them, and he had been honest about who he was and what he had been sent to do, which surprised all of them in different ways. On Saturday evening, he rode back to the Underwood homestead. The barn was full. He stood in the door for a moment before going in, and he was struck again by the plainness of it and the power of it. 30 or more people gathered in the lantern light among the hay bales and the smell of horses, with their coats still on and their faces serious and attentive. Men and women both, old and young, several of them with children on their laps or beside them. At the front of the barn, standing on a hay bale to be seen, was Mamie Underwood. She had changed from her work clothes into a dark green dress with a white collar, and she had her hair pinned up more formally than the day he had met her, and she stood in the lantern light and spoke to those 30 people with a clarity and a force that was nothing like speech-making and everything like the truth being spoken plainly. "I am not going to tell you what to do," she was saying, when Orville slipped inside and stood at the back. "Every one of you has to make the decision that is right for your family. But I am going to tell you what I know, and what I know is this. These agreements were not what we were told they were. We were desperate and we were deceived, and the law exists precisely for situations like this one. Mr. Hargreaves in Alamosa has reviewed 7 of the agreements, and he believes all 7 can be successfully contested. The question is whether we have the will to do it." A man in the front raised his hand. Orville recognized him as Heinrich Bauer, the father of 5. "What about the penalty clause? $500 if we go to court." Mr. Hargreaves believes the penalty clause is unenforceable because the misrepresentation that induces a contract vitiates the contract as a whole, Mamie said, using the legal language with a precision that told him she had been studying. "He will argue that the penalty clause falls with the rest of it. And if he is wrong, then we will cross that ditch when we come to it," she said. "But I am not willing to surrender this valley to a man in Denver who never breathed its air or worked its soil simply because I am afraid of what might go wrong. My children will grow up on this land. So will yours. That is worth fighting for." The silence after that was the kind of silence that precedes a decision. Orville had not intended to speak. He had come, he told himself, simply to listen. But he was standing there in the back of that barn with 30 people making one of the hardest decisions of their lives, and he knew something they did not, and he could not make himself stay quiet. "Excuse me," he said. Every head turned. The temperature in the barn dropped about 5 degrees, or at least it felt that way. Mamie Underwood turned and found him at the back, and her expression went through several rapid changes: surprise, caution, and then something complicated and watchful. "This is Orville Granger," she said steadily. "He works for Meridian Land and Cattle." The silence became a different kind of silence. "I do," Orville said, and he walked forward through the parting crowd to the open space at the front of the barn, where he turned and faced all of them. "I was sent here by Harlan Voss to convince you to honor your agreements. I want to tell you that I am not going to do that." The silence cracked. Several people spoke at once. Mamie raised a hand and the room went quiet again, and she looked at Orville with those clear brown eyes and gave him a small, precise nod that meant, "Go on." "I have read the agreements," he said. "All of them that Mrs. Underwood has collected here. I have also spoken with Cephas Webb, and I have done my own calculation of current land values in this valley. What I can tell you is that the price per acre written into these documents is criminally low, that the structure of the documents was designed to obscure that price, and that any competent territorial court is going to look hard at the question of informed consent. You have a legitimate case. Mrs. Underwood is right, and I should not be telling you this, which is why you should probably believe it." He stopped. He had said what he came to say. He was aware that he had just destroyed his relationship with Harlan Voss, who was his employer, and probably his career in land negotiation, and quite possibly his ability to find work in the entire territory of Colorado. He was also aware that he felt, for the first time in approximately 3 years, like himself. Mamie was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "Thank you, Mr. Granger," she said. She said it simply, without excess, the way she said most things, and it landed in him with a weight that surprised him. After the meeting, after the families had made their decision, 12 of the 14 formally joining the legal contest, the other 2 saying they needed more time. After the barn emptied and the lanterns were carried back to the house, Orville found himself sitting on the fence rail outside the barn, looking up at a sky crammed with stars, waiting for something he could not quite name. He heard her boots on the hard ground before he saw her. "You have a long ride back to Denver," she said, coming to stand near the fence. She had brought 2 cups of coffee from the house, which he was beginning to understand was her version of an olive branch. "I am not going back to Denver yet," he said, taking the cup. She leaned against the fence post. "You do realize that what you said in there will get back to Voss within the week. I expect it will, and you are not concerned." "I am very concerned," he said honestly, "but that is separate from whether I should have said it." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley in the dark, the vast shadow of the mountains against the deeper shadow of the sky. The stars reflected in the distant thread of the river. "Why did you come tonight?" she asked. "You had no obligation to come." "I am not entirely sure," he said, which was both true and not true. "I suppose I wanted to see what you had built." She looked at him then, sidelong, and for a moment the composure she wore so naturally slipped just slightly, showing something beneath it that was less certain, more human, and more compelling for all of that. "It is not my building," she said. "It belongs to all of them. I only called the first meeting." "You called the first meeting when you were a new widow with 2 children and a land dispute with a man who has lawyers in Denver," Orville said. "Do not undersell what that took." She turned her face away, and in the starlight he could see the careful control with which she received the compliment. "My son is 8, she said after a moment. "His name is Daniel, my daughter is 6, her name is Rose. I think about them every time someone in a meeting asks if this is worth the fight." "And is it?" "Always," she said without hesitation. "Always." He stayed in Callow Creek. He wrote to Harlan Voss the following Monday, a letter that was precise and professional, and that effectively informed Voss that Orville's assessment of the situation was that the contested agreements would not survive a territorial court challenge, and that pursuing them would result in significant negative press coverage that would damage Meridian land and cattle's ability to operate in the territory. He did not say that he had switched sides. He said it in the language of practical advice, which was perhaps a cowardice, but it was the language most likely to actually be read. Voss's reply came 9 days later and was brief and furious, and contained the information that Orville's employment was terminated effective immediately. Orville read the letter in his room at the Drover's Rest, and then folded it carefully and put it in his saddlebag. He went downstairs and told Clara Hofstadter he would need the room for at least another month, and Clara Hofstadter looked at him for a long moment and then charged him the regular rate. The legal challenge moved forward through November and into December with a momentum that surprised even the attorney from Alamosa, a compact, serious-faced man named Hargreaves who wore the same 3-piece suit to every hearing and who turned out to be considerably more formidable than he looked. The territorial court in Alamosa agreed to hear the consolidated challenge from the 12 families, and the hearing was set for late February. In the meantime, Harlan Voss sent a new representative not to the valley this time, but to the courthouse, in the form of a Denver attorney named Solomon Price, who was polished and expensive, and who made it very clear that Meridian land and cattle intended to defend every one of its agreements. Orville attended the preliminary court sessions as an observer, and eventually as something more. He had, it turned out, detailed knowledge of how Meridian land and cattle operated, of how the agreements had been structured, of the instructions Voss had given his field representatives during the drought. He could not testify to things covered by attorney-client privilege, but the things that were not so covered the operational decisions, the deliberate structuring of the documents, the instructions to target families in financial distress. These things he knew and could speak to. And Hargreaves, after a long conversation with Orville on a cold afternoon in Hargreaves's Alamosa office, asked him to prepare a written statement. In the valley itself, through those winter months, Orville found a role that he had not anticipated. He knew land law, and he knew how to read documents, and the families involved in the challenge had need of someone who could help them understand the papers that kept arriving from Denver, the legal filings, the counter-arguments, the demands for documentation. He spent mornings helping Heinrich Bauer prepare records of his payments and improvements to his land, which established his length of occupancy and investment. He spent afternoons helping the Domings family locate their original homestead filing papers from territorial records. He borrowed Cephas Webb's law books and read them in the evenings at the hotel, teaching himself the specific provisions of Colorado Territory land law with the same methodical determination he had previously applied to reading contracts for Voss. He kept returning to the Underwood homestead. He told himself this was because Mamie was the organizing center of the challenge, and therefore the person he needed to coordinate with most frequently. This was true. It was not the whole truth. What was also true was that he found, in the company of Mamie Underwood, something he had not known he was missing. It was not simply that she was capable, though she was dramatically so, with a quality of practical intelligence that she applied to every problem from fixing a stuck barn door hinge to composing a letter to the governor's office. It was not simply that she was formidable, though she was that too, in the way of a person who has faced the worst and come through it still standing. It was that she was, underneath all of that, quietly and carefully herself. She read books late at night after the children were asleep, holding them close to the lamp with a kind of hungry absorption. She had opinions about local politics and about books, and about the best variety of winter wheat for high-altitude planting, and she stated all of them with the same calm conviction. She was funny, in a dry and unexpected way that ambushed him repeatedly. She was kind to her children with the specific and attentive kindness of a parent who has thought about it and chosen it deliberately. And she was honest in a way that Orville, who had spent 3 years in a profession that rewarded strategic inexactness with the truth, found almost physically refreshing. He was falling in love with her. He knew it by mid-November, knew it with the clarity of a man who has been trying not to know something, and has finally lost that argument with himself. He was also aware that the timing was about as complicated as timing could get, given that he was the man Voss had sent to stop her, and that she had every reason to view him with suspicion, and given that she was a widow who was in the middle of the most significant fight of her life, and given that he was technically unemployed and sleeping in a hotel room in a town he had not planned to stay in. He said nothing about any of this. He showed up and did the work and was careful to keep his expression professionally neutral when she brushed past him in the narrow space between her kitchen table and the stove. He was not always successful at this, but he tried. It was Daniel, her 8-year-old, who first made it difficult to maintain any fiction about his feelings. Daniel was a serious, dark-eyed child who had his mother's precision and his late father's, from what Orville gathered, easy affability, and he had decided within approximately 1 week of Orville's increased presence at the homestead that Orville was the most interesting person he had encountered in his 8 years, primarily because Orville knew an enormous number of card tricks and had once, briefly, helped break horses for a ranch in Wyoming. On a Saturday afternoon in early December, while his mother was writing letters at the table inside, and Orville was repairing a section of fence that had come down in the last windstorm, Daniel came and sat on the fence rail nearby and watched with the unself-conscious attention of a child who has not yet learned to disguise his interest. "Do you like my mother?" Daniel asked. Orville kept his hands on the fence rail and did not look at the child, because he had a feeling his face would not help him here. "Your mother is a remarkable person," he said carefully. "That is not what I asked," Daniel said. Orville looked at him then. The boy had his chin propped on his hands and his dark eyes were entirely serious. "I think," Orville said slowly, "that your mother is the most admirable person I have met in a long time." Daniel appeared to weigh this. "She cried on the anniversary of Papa's death," he said, not with sadness but with the matter-of-fact seriousness of a child who is passing on important information. She thinks we did not hear her, but we did. Rose cried too. I did not cry because someone had to look after the chickens and crying takes a long time. He paused. She does not cry other times. She is very strong. She is, Orville agreed. Papa used to say she was the strongest person he knew, Daniel said. He told me that. He said, your mother could move a mountain if she decided it needed moving, and you should always be grateful to have someone like that in your corner. The boy's voice was entirely steady, which cost him something. Orville could see that. I think Papa would like that she is fighting for the farm. I think he would like that you are helping. Orville stood very still for a moment with the fence rail in his hands and the December wind coming down off the mountains, and he felt something in the center of his chest move like a fault line shifting. I think your papa sounds like he was a very good man, he said. He was, Daniel said simply. Are you going to stay in Callow Creek? Orville considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think I am, he said. Yes, Daniel nodded, apparently satisfied, and hopped down from the rail and went inside. Orville finished the fence and stood looking at the mountains for a while. December in the San Luis Valley was cold and clear and expansive, the sky an enormous blue that seemed too big for any ordinary landscape, and the mountains wearing their full winter white. The valley itself was quiet in the way of farming country in winter, the work different rather than less, the pace internal rather than external, firewood and livestock, and the careful management of stores against the months ahead. Christmas came and went with a simplicity that Orville found he valued in a way he had not expected. He had spent recent Christmases in Denver hotels, eating at good restaurants with colleagues who were either going home to families or trying to forget that they were not. In Callow Creek, Christmas was a church service and a community dinner in the schoolhouse and children running in and out of the cold with their new mittens on. Mamie's children had received between them a set of wooden blocks that Cephas Webb had carved, a cloth doll for Rose, and a penknife for Daniel, and they were transparently delighted with all of it. Orville had brought a small wrapped package to the homestead on Christmas Eve, when he had been invited for the holiday supper, and he had felt suddenly awkward about it when he arrived, wondering if it was too much or too forward or inappropriate in some way he had not anticipated. It was a book, 2 books actually, bound together, a collection of poems and an almanac, wrapped in brown paper. He had brought it for Mamie. He had spent 3 separate afternoons arguing with himself about whether to bring it at all. She opened it after supper, when the children were settled by the fire with their new things, and she read the title page of the poetry collection, and then looked up at him with an expression of genuine, unguarded pleasure that was different from anything he had seen on her face before. It was younger and softer, and it struck him with the force of something he had not prepared his defenses for. Robert Browning, she said. You mentioned him in October, he said. When we were going through the Bauer papers, you quoted something and I could not place it. She looked back at the book. You remembered that. I tend to remember things you say. The silence that followed was long enough to be significant. She closed the book carefully and held it in both hands and looked at the fire for a moment. Orville, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He was aware of the fire crackling and the children's quiet voices and the wind against the window and his own heartbeat. I know what this is, she said slowly. What is happening? I am not a woman who is ignorant of her own situation. She paused. I am also not a woman who acts carelessly. I have 2 children and a legal battle and a farm to run, and I have been a widow for less than 2 years. I know, he said. I am not asking anything of you. You are not asking anything yet, she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not a refusal, not quite a door opened, but an acknowledgement that a door existed that was more than he had allowed himself to hope for. No, he said, not yet. She looked at him again, and the firelight was in her eyes, and she held the book to her chest and gave him a small and careful smile that he decided then, and there, he would do whatever it took to see again. The legal hearing in a limosa came on the 22nd of February, 1885. The families had spent the winter preparing, gathering documents and statements, and the evidence of their long occupancy and investment in the valley land. Hargreaves had built a careful and thorough case. Orville's written statement, detailing the operational practices of Meridian land and cattle, and the specific instructions that had been given to field representatives during the drought, was filed with the court in early February and caused, according to Hargreaves, a considerable amount of activity in Solomon Price's Denver office. They rode to Alamosa in a group, 11 wagons and a dozen horses on the road south, through the winter morning with the mountains blazing with reflected sunrise. Mamie rode beside Orville on the road, her horse a stout bay named General who carried her with the unpretentious steadiness that matched her own. She had her good coat on and her good hat, and she had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything, thoroughly and without display. "Are you nervous?" Orville asked her as they came down into the valley flats. "Terrified," she said cheerfully. "You?" "Yes," he said, also terrified. She glanced at him sideways and a genuine laugh escaped her, short and warm, and it was so unexpected and lovely that Orville felt something light up behind his sternum like a match being struck. "Well," she said, "at least we are terrified in good company." The hearing lasted 3 days. On the 3rd day, the territorial judge, a lean, methodical man named Harmon who had apparently read every document filed with great care, and who asked questions of Solomon Price that made the Denver attorney visibly uncomfortable, issued a preliminary ruling that he found sufficient grounds to void 7 of the 12 agreements on the basis of fraudulent misrepresentation, and that he would issue a full ruling on the remaining 5 within 30 days. The preliminary ruling was not a final victory. Orville made sure everyone understood that. But it was a victory nonetheless, and the families standing in the cold outside the Alamosa courthouse understood that, and there was a quiet, held-breath moment of relief that was more moving than celebration would have been. Mamie stood a little apart, looking at the courthouse steps, and Orville went to stand beside her. 7, she said softly. 7 so far, he said. Harmon will rule on the other 5. Hargreaves thinks at least 3 more. She nodded slowly. Then she turned to him, and there in the cold Alamosa morning, with her people filing past them toward their horses and wagons, she reached out and put her hand briefly against his forearm. It was only a moment, and she wore gloves and so did he, and it was the most decorous possible touch, and it stopped his blood completely. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "I did not do it for thanks," he said. "I know," she said. "That is exactly why I am thanking you." March arrived and brought mud and the first green shoots, and the full ruling from Judge Harmon, which voided 10 of the 12 agreements and ordered Meridian land and cattle to return the cash payments that had been made, plus interest, to the 2 families, whose agreements were upheld on the grounds that those 2 families had had independent legal advice at the time of signing. The 2 families whose agreements were upheld were the Altons, who were young and had not fully understood the nature of what they faced, and a bachelor farmer named Sims who had no family and had appeared to understand more of what he signed than the others. For those 2 families, there was a separate conversation to be had. Mamie organized a community effort, a fund, essentially, contributed to by the other 12 families and several townspeople, to help the Altons and Sims make the back payments that would allow them to retain their land under the agreed terms. It was the kind of solution that no court would have ordered, that no legal document provided for, and that happened purely because Mamie Underwood thought it should happen, and then went about making it happen. Orville was at the meeting when she proposed it and watched the room agree, watched the Alton couple, Pete and Ruth then, who were perhaps 22 and 20 years old, and had been holding hands under the table through the whole meeting, dissolve briefly into tears, and he felt the expansion of something in him that he had been keeping contained for months. After the meeting, walking back through the spring mud toward the hotel, he was aware of Mamie walking beside him in the early evening, and he made a decision. "Mamie," he said, and it had become natural by now, the use of her first name, though it still registered in him each time. "Yes," she said. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said. "Not as a colleague, as I would like it to be a different kind of occasion." She walked 2 more steps before she responded, and he counted them. "The hotel dining room." She said, "If you would prefer. Or I thought the Garza family has opened a place on the south end of Main Street." "I have been curious about the Garza place," she said, in a tone that was almost casual and was not casual at all. "Saturday?" he asked. "Saturday," she said, and then, after a pause that was comfortable rather than awkward, "I will need to arrange for Mrs. Hofstadter to sit with the children." "Of course," he said. "Daniel will probably have opinions about this," she said. "I am prepared for Daniel's opinions," he said. She made a small sound that was definitely a suppressed laugh, and they walked the rest of the way to the hotel in a silence that was entirely different from the silence they had been maintaining for months. This silence was warm and anticipatory, and full of things being understood without being said. Saturday arrived with a clear sky, and the smell of new grass, and the mountains showing their bare rock faces above the retreating snow line. Orville spent an unreasonable amount of time considering his clothing options, and ended up in his good coat and a clean white shirt, which was the best he could do, and which he decided would have to be sufficient. He arrived at the homestead at 6 in the evening to find that Daniel had, in fact, had opinions, and had expressed them to his mother in the form of a series of careful questions about Orville's intentions and character that Mamie relayed to him later, with such perfectly maintained solemnity that it was clear she had found them deeply charming. He also found that Rose, who was 6 and who had thus far regarded him with the polite distance of a child who is watching to see if a person is worth her time, had apparently decided he was, because she showed him, very seriously, the drawing she had made of the barn cat, and then asked if he was going to marry her mother. "Rose," Mamie said, in a tone of gentle reproach from the doorway. "Clara Hofstadter says he is going to," Rose said, with the impeccable logic of a 6-year-old reporting community consensus. Orville caught Mamie's eye across the room and received the extraordinary reward of watching Mamie Underwood, who was not in the habit of being visibly embarrassed, go slightly pink. He told Rose that he thought her drawing was very fine and that the barn cat looked exactly right. They walked to the Garza place, which served the food of the valley's Mexican-American families, chili and pozole and tortillas that came hot from the kitchen, and they sat across from each other in the warm lantern light and talked for 3 hours without running out of things to say. They talked about the legal challenge and what would come next, and then they talked about other things entirely. About her childhood in Missouri, in a farming family of 6, the middle child and the one, she said, who could never be persuaded to stay quiet when staying quiet would have been wiser. About his early years in Illinois and the law studies he had begun and not finished, interrupted by his father's illness, and then by the economic contraction of the late 1870s that had led him, by a series of steps that seemed logical at the time, to land negotiation in Denver. "Do you miss the law?" she asked. "I miss the idea of it," he said. "The practice of using the law honestly. I did not always do that in the work I was doing." She looked at him steadily across the table. "You are doing it now," she said. "I am trying to," he said. "It feels different." "Different how?" He considered the question. "When you work in the service of something true," he said, "the work feels like itself. When you do not, it feels like wearing clothes that do not fit. I spent 3 years in clothes that did not fit." She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands, and then she said, "Thomas, my husband, was a man who wore himself exactly. He never tried to be other than what he was. I think that was the thing I loved most about him." She paused. "I am telling you this because I think you should know that I recognize the quality, and I think it is in you." Orville was very careful about how he received this. It was not a declaration. It was not a comparison. It was something more specific, an offer of understanding from a woman who was precise about everything, including her feelings, and who was saying, I see you." It landed in him with the gravity of something true. "Thank you for that," he said. Walking home through the spring night, the valley enormous around them and the stars doing their extravagant work overhead, Mamie took his arm. She did it naturally, without ceremony, her hand in the crook of his elbow, and they walked the 1.5 miles to the homestead road in a comfortable, warm quiet. At the gate she stopped, and she turned to face him, and Orville Granger, who had done a great many brave things in the last several months, understood that the bravest thing he had done and was about to do were in a different category entirely. "I would like to see you again," he said. "Like this." "I would like that too," she said. And then she looked at him with those clear brown eyes in the starlight, steady and direct and fully present, and she said, "I am not a quick mover, Orville. I do not make decisions carelessly, but I make them honestly, and when I make one, I mean it completely." "I know," he said. "I am not in a hurry." "Good," she said softly. And she went up the porch steps and turned at the door and gave him one long look before she went inside, a look that had warmth in it and something like promise. And he stood at the gate in the dark and breathed the spring night air and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Spring deepened into summer, and with it, the shape of Orville's life in Callow Creek settled and changed and became something solid. He had found work with Cephas Webb, assisting with the volume of legal paperwork that the land challenge had generated and continuing even as the challenge wound down, because it turned out that Callow Creek needed exactly the kind of careful, document-savvy work that Orville did well, and that there was enough of it to justify a modest living. He rented a small house on the south end of town, a 2-room adobe with a stove that drew well and a view of the mountains, and he furnished it with the minimum necessary and felt unexpectedly content. He and Mamie moved through their courtship with the deliberate pace she had indicated and he had accepted, and he found, to his surprise, that the pace suited him. There was something valuable in the slowness, in the way it allowed each thing to be itself before becoming something else. He learned her in pieces, her humor and her temper, and the way she moved through worry, which was to become very still and very focused, and the way she laughed when she was truly surprised, which was with her whole face and was rare enough to be worth waiting for. He learned that she was afraid of the dark in thunderstorms, not the thunder itself but the quality of dark between lightning strikes, and that she covered this by becoming briskly practical about storm preparation whenever she heard thunder in the distance. He learned that she kept a journal, small and leather-bound, that she never left where the children could reach it, and that she wrote in it late at night. He learned that she had loved her husband deeply and mourned him honestly, and that this was not, as some people seem to assume, a closed door, but rather a part of who she was, a woman who knew what real love looked like and was not prepared to settle for anything less. In June, there was a dance at the schoolhouse, organized by the families who had won their legal challenge as a celebration of the spring planting and a general expression of gratitude for still being where they were. The Domings family brought musicians, a grandfather who played fiddle and 2 cousins with guitars, and the schoolhouse floor was cleared, and everyone in the valley came, from the Bowers with their 5 children to old Cephas Webb, who turned out to be an excellent and very energetic dancer. Orville danced with Mamie twice. The first time was a group dance, a Virginia reel, which was largely chaos and required almost no proximity and was wonderful regardless. The second time was a waltz late in the evening, when the children were asleep in corners, and the adults had settled into the warm, comfortable end of a good night. He put his hand at her waist and took her hand, and she looked up at him with an expression that was open in a way she rarely allowed herself to be in company, and they danced. She was not a trained dancer, but she was naturally graceful, and she moved with him with an ease that told him they understood each other's rhythms. He was very aware of the warmth of her hand in his and her nearness in the lamplight. "You are a good dancer," she said after a while. "I had a very good partner," he said. She made a small sound of mock skepticism that did not entirely conceal how pleased she was. After the dance, walking home through the summer night, the children collected and half asleep in the wagon that Heinrich Bauer drove home for her, she said, very quietly so that no one else could hear. I am getting less afraid, Orville. He looked at her in the dark. Of what? Of being happy again, she said simply, and looked straight ahead at the road. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they walked like that to the gate of the homestead. July was hot and full of work, the summer wheat coming up and the kitchen garden demanding attention, and the legal paperwork from the Alamosa court continuing to require responses and filings. Orville came to the homestead every day, ostensibly for one reason or another, and increasingly for no reason other than that it was where he wanted to be. On a Tuesday afternoon, when the children were in town at the schoolhouse summer program, and the homestead was quiet in the way it rarely was, he came to help Mamie move a section of irrigation ditch that had silted up and needed to be redirected. They spent 2 hours knee-deep in the summer heat with shovels, redirecting the channel through the kitchen garden, and when it was done and the water was running clean and straight, Mamie sat down on the bank with her boots off and her feet in the ditch water and looked up at him with complete contentment. He sat down beside her. The water was cold and the sun was very warm and the mountains were deep blue against the white and gold sky, and he said, without any particular preparation, I am in love with you. She looked at him. The water ran over their feet and the meadowlarks were doing something complicated in the field nearby, and the summer afternoon was enormous and still around them. I know, she said, not smugly, not evasively, but honestly the way she said everything. Do you? He said. No only, or Orville, she said, and she turned to face him fully and she looked at him with those clear brown eyes and everything that she was, everything capable and strong and careful and tender and funny and honest that she was in her face. I love you too. I have known it for a while and I have been taking my time with it because it is not a small thing, but I know it. He kissed her then, there on the bank of the irrigation ditch in the July afternoon, and she kissed him back with the same deliberate sureness with which she did everything, her hand coming up to his jaw, and it was exactly right in every way. When they broke apart, she looked at him, and the small, real smile was there, the one that changed her face, and he thought he had never in his life seen anything so worth arriving at slowly. He proposed to her in August, in the evening on the porch while the children were inside finishing supper, with no particular preamble except that it felt like the right moment and it was the right moment. He asked her properly, formally, because she deserved formality and he wanted to give it to her, and she said yes with the same straightforwardness with which she had said everything else, and then she said, Daniel will probably want to tell everyone in town before morning. I expect he will, Orville said. He has been waiting for this since December. She laughed fully and freely and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and from inside the house they heard Rose ask Daniel what was happening, and Daniel's voice, clear and satisfied, say, I think they are engaged. They were married in October, 1 year almost to the day from the morning Orville had ridden up to the gate and found her splitting wood. The ceremony was in the church, which was full to the walls with the people of the valley who had known Mamie Underwood through her grief and her fight and her long, quiet rebuilding, and who came now with genuine joy. Hargreaves rode up from Alamosa. Cephas Webb performed the ceremony with the careful dignity of a man who understood that he was doing something important. Mamie wore a dress of deep blue wool, not wedding white, because she was practical and deep blue could be worn again, and also because it was the color he had first seen her in, and she knew it with her hair down for the occasion, and she looked at him across the church with those clear, warm eyes, and said her vows in a clear, steady voice that did not waver at all. He said his vows looking back at her, meaning every word with the full weight of a man who had spent 31 years finding something worth meaning. The wedding supper was in the Bauer barn, which was the largest barn in the valley, and the Domings musicians played, and Heinrich Bauer's eldest daughter had made 3 pies, and Pete Alton got slightly too much whiskey into him, and made a toast that was approximately 8 minutes long and touchingly sincere. And Daniel danced with Rose and stepped on her feet with great regularity and complete cheerfulness. He moved into the homestead because it was hers and it was the children's home, and it made no sense to do otherwise. He brought his books and his saddlebag and 3 months' worth of the work he had been doing for Cephas Webb, and he put his things in the house, and it became, without any ceremony, home. The winter they spent together, the first winter as a family, with the adobe warm and the fire going and the children doing their schoolwork at the table and Mamie at her writing in the evenings, was the best winter Orville Granger could remember. It was ordinary in the way that good winters are, quiet evenings and cold mornings, and the work of maintaining a homestead in the season and the specific pleasure of being where you belong. He took on the legal work seriously, establishing himself as the valley's de facto land attorney, which was a modest living but a real one, and which Cephas Webb, who was getting on in years and whose eyesight was failing, was increasingly relieved to have help with. He studied by mail, corresponding with a territorial bar examiner in Denver, working toward a formal qualification that would allow him to practice properly. Daniel, who had turned 9 and who had the energy of a small weather system, attached himself to Orville with the uncomplicated warmth of a child who has decided something and sees no reason to be ambivalent about it. He wanted to know everything about horses and card tricks and how legal documents worked and how to fish the river in spring. And Orville, who had never been anyone's father and had not been certain he would know how, discovered that what was required was simply to be present and honest and willing to answer questions, which were things he could do. Rose was more reserved in her affection, which was also who she was, she observed before she committed, the way her mother did, and Orville respected it and did not try to hurry it. By February, she had decided he could be trusted, evidenced by the fact that she began showing him her drawings without being asked, which was apparently the signal she used for full acceptance. He treated the drawings with the seriousness they deserved, because they were genuinely very good, and Rose began to look at him the way she looked at things that had earned their place in her world. In March of 1886, Mamie told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before the children were up, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup, and a look on her face that was both certain and watching him. He sat across from her and looked at her and felt something in him expand in a way that was almost frightening in its size. How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I'm expecting a child," she said in her dry way, and then the dry way fell away and she smiled the full, real smile and said, "I feel very well, Orville." He reached across the table and covered both her hands with one of his. "We will need to tell Daniel," he said. "He will probably have a list of preferred names." She laughed. "He already told me last month that if we ever had children he thought a good name for a boy would be General, after the horse. We can perhaps negotiate on that," Orville said. She turned her hands under his and held them and looked at him over their coffee cups in the March morning, and the kitchen was warm and the snow was still on the mountains and everything outside the window was the silver gray of early spring before the green comes back. "I did not know," she said quietly, "that I would have this again. I thought after Thomas, I thought that part of my life was finished, that I had had it and lost it and that was how it was." She paused. "I was wrong." "I am very glad you were wrong," he said. "So am I," she said. The summer of 1886 was long and good. The valley that had been threatened by Voss's land scheme was now secure. The legal rulings had been finalized, the option agreements were void, and Meridian land and cattle, after the congressional interest that Mamie's letters had generated, had retreated from the San Luis Valley entirely. Harlan Voss had sent no further representatives. There had been a brief mention in the Denver papers in April, a report on the Alamosa rulings that characterized the outcome as a significant setback for certain Colorado land speculation interests, and Orville had read it at the breakfast table and felt not triumph exactly, but a clean, settled satisfaction. He passed his bar examination in May, conducted in Denver by the territorial examiner, and came home to Callow Creek with the certificate in his saddlebag, and a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the certificate and everything to do with what was waiting at the end of the road. Mamie met him on the porch with the children behind her, and when he held up the certificate she came down the porch steps and put her arms around him right there in the yard in front of Daniel and Rose and the barn cat, which was unprecedented. "You did it," she said, her face against his shoulder. "We did it," he said. "I could not have sat those examinations without the last 2 years of practice." Daniel from the porch said, "Does this mean we can celebrate?" And Rose, standing beside him, said, "Can we have pie?" They had pie. The baby came in November, right on time, delivered by the same capable midwife who had delivered half the valley's children. It was a boy, born on a cold, clear night with the stars blazing outside the bedroom window, and he was healthy and loud, and had an immediate, emphatic opinion about the world that Orville recognized as a family trait. They named him James, after Thomas Underwood's father, which had been Mamie's idea and which Orville had agreed to without hesitation, because it was right, and because he understood what it meant to her to honor the life she had lived before, and to carry it forward rather than leave it behind. James Granger was welcomed into a household that already included Daniel, who declared him interesting but small, and Rose, who immediately began drawing pictures of him with a seriousness that suggested a new subject had been found, and General the bay horse in the barn and the barn cat, and 14 acres of winter wheat, and an irrigation ditch that had been redirected the previous summer, and was now running clean and true. The valley that winter was quiet and prosperous. The homesteads settled into their security. The community that had formed around the legal challenge deepened and strengthened by what they had done together. The Bauer family's youngest, the one who had been 7 months old when Mamie first organized against the land grab, was now nearly 3 and could run at speed through the kitchen garden. The Alton couple had their first child in September, a daughter they named Frances. The Domings family had planted a new orchard along the river and fully expected in 5 years to have the best apple trees in the territory. On a Sunday afternoon in December, when the baby was asleep and Daniel was at the Bauer farm playing with the Bauer boys and Rose was at the kitchen table with her drawings, Orville sat on the porch in his coat watching the mountains do their winter business, and Mamie came out and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee and her old canvas barn coat on. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He accepted the coffee cup. "The first time I rode up to this gate," he said. "I did not have any idea what was going to happen. Were you frightened of me?" she asked. "Absolutely," he said. Within about 30 seconds, she gave a small, satisfied sound. "Good." He looked at her in profile, the strong, fine-boned face and the auburn hair showing the first threads of early gray at the temple that she would deny noticing for at least another year, and the direct, warm composure that was still and always the first thing you encountered when you met her. "You know," he said, "I was sent here to stop you." "I know," she said. "I could not make myself do it," he said. She turned and looked at him, and there was laughter in her eyes and something deeper than laughter. "I know that too," she said. "I was there." "I am not sorry," he said. "No," she said, "neither am I." From inside the house, Rose called out that the baby was making sounds, which in Rose's vocabulary meant making the preliminary sounds that preceded a significant sound, and Mamie set down her coffee cup and stood, and paused to put her hand briefly on the back of his neck, warm and familiar and particular to her, before she went inside. Orville sat on the porch of the homestead that had become his home, in the valley that had become his place, in the life he had found by losing the one he thought he was living, and looked at the mountains going gold in the afternoon light, and felt the deep and steady happiness of a man who knows that he is exactly where he belongs. Spring came again, as it always did, in a slow green tied up the valley floor while the mountains held their white for a while longer, stubborn and gorgeous. James had learned to roll and was working, with extraordinary concentration, on sitting up. Daniel had begun to show a genuine aptitude for horses, spending his afternoons in the corral with a patience and instinctive attunement that Orville recognized and nurtured carefully, understanding that some abilities are too specific to be taught and can only be given room to grow. Rose had, in the course of the winter, produced a series of drawings of the valley in its various seasons that were technically remarkable for a 7-year-old and personally remarkable for anyone. And Mamie had found, in a catalog from a Denver goods company, a proper set of drawing pencils and a sketchbook that she ordered and presented to Rose on her birthday with a gravity that told Rose she was being taken seriously, which was all Rose had ever wanted. The legal practice grew, steadily and without drama, into something that justified itself fully. The San Luis Valley, with its complex mix of original Spanish land grant holders, newer Anglo homesteaders, and the ongoing questions about water rights and grazing boundaries, generated enough legitimate legal work to keep a careful and honest practitioner busy through every season. Orville developed a particular skill with the water rights questions, which were some of the most complicated in the territory, and he took several of these to the Alamosa court and won 2 of 3, which established his reputation in a way that Hargreaves, who had become something like a friend through correspondence, said was the kind of reputation that held. In the summer, the community that had formed around the fight against the land grab had its first proper reunion, a gathering at the Bauer farm that the Bauers insisted on hosting because, Heinrich Bauer said, they had not lost their farm and therefore they intended to celebrate that fact on a regular basis for as long as any of them lived. The Domings musicians played, and the women organized a supper that went on for 3 hours, and the men sat in the long summer evening and talked about crops and irrigation, and the rail line that was rumored to be coming south through the valley, which would change everything when it did. Pete Alton, sitting beside his wife Ruthann, who was expecting their second child, said to Orville, "Do you ever think about where you would be if you had done what Voss sent you to do?" Orville considered the question honestly. "I try not to," he said, "because wherever I would be, it would be the wrong place." Pete nodded and looked at his wife, who was laughing at something with Mamie a few feet away, and said, "Yes, that is exactly right." Across the gathering, Mamie caught Orville's eye and held it for a moment, just a moment, the way married people do, the specific private acknowledgement that passes between 2 people who have built something together and know it. And he felt the familiar expansion in his chest that had never, in all the months and now years of knowing her, diminished. He had come to this valley to stop a woman who was fighting for something true and good and right, and he had found, in the failure to stop her, everything worth having. He had been afraid, coming in, that he was nothing better than the instrument of someone else's greed. He had discovered, in choosing not to be, what kind of man he actually was. He had discovered it because she had given him the opportunity, simply by being herself direct and clear and unwilling to be anything less than fully honest about what was real. Daniel came running across the Bauer yard and skidded to a stop beside him, face flushed from some game with the Bauer boys, and said, "Can I ride General after supper?" "If your mother agrees," Orville said. "I already asked," Daniel said, with the smooth efficiency of a child who has learned to work a system. "She said to ask you." Orville looked at him, this serious, bright-eyed, good-hearted boy who had accepted him with such undefended generosity, who had grown 2 inches since Christmas, and who was going to be as tall as Orville by the time he was 15, and felt the specific and unreproducible love of a parent for a child. "After supper," he said, "and stay inside the pasture." Daniel was already running back before the sentence was finished. The rail line did come, 2 years later in the summer of 1888, and it changed everything in the way that things which change everything always do, not by making the essential nature of the valley different, but by multiplying the possibilities of what was already there. The Domings apples found a market in Denver. Heinrich Bauer expanded his operation and put on 2 hired hands. The town of Callow Creek grew by a third in the first year after the rail arrived, which meant more families, more disputes, more legal work, more community. Mamie, who had organized one valley against a land grab and helped sustain the community through 2 years of legal challenge, and who had, in all of that time, never stopped being a working farmer first, turned her attention in the rail era to the question of the Cooperative Irrigation Association, which was a more complex and more stubborn problem than the land grab had been in some ways, because it required not just defending what was there but building something new. She organized the meetings, she corresponded with the Territorial Water Board, she wrote the founding documents with Orville's help, and by 1889, the Callow Creek Valley Irrigation Cooperative was a functioning legal entity that managed the water rights of 23 member farms on principles of equitable allocation that held up through drought and through flood, because they had been designed honestly for the actual conditions of the actual valley by people who knew both. The second Granger child, a second boy, arrived in late 1888, healthy and vocal, and was named for Thomas Underwood's mother's family name Morgan and absorbed into the household with the cheerful pragmatism of a family that had, by then, developed very efficient systems for everything. Daniel, who was 12, had definite opinions about babies and expressed them plainly. Rose, who was 10 and who had become a small, observant, artistically serious person of considerable character, drew Morgan's portrait on his second day and presented it to Mamie with the gravity of an official record. James, who was 2 and still at the age when everything in the world was a discovery and a delight, inspected the new baby with the thorough attention of a scientist and then declared him acceptable, which everyone agreed was the correct response. On an October evening, the October of 1889, Orville sat at the desk in what had become his study, the room off the main house that he had built on the south side in the spring, with its window looking out over the winter wheat field and beyond it to the mountains. He was reviewing a water rights case that would go to a limosa in December, and the lamp was lit, and the house was quiet in the way it was quiet when all 4 children were finally asleep, which was the best and most particular quiet there was. Mamie came in with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the chair across the desk from him, tucking her feet up under her the way she did when she was comfortable, and opened her book, the Robert Browning from That First Christmas, worn now at the spine and annotated in the margins in her precise handwriting. They sat in the lamplight, working and reading respectively, in a silence that was full of everything. The mountains were out there in the dark, doing their permanent, enormous work. The valley was settled and quiet around them, its fields in their autumn gold, its families in their homes, its disputes being managed by instruments of law that were imperfect but honest, its water running clean through ditches that had been built with common effort. After a while, Mamie looked up from her book and watched him work for a moment, and he became aware of her watching and looked up. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I am just glad you came here." He looked at her across the desk, this woman who had moved a mountain because she decided it needed moving, who had organized a valley and fought a powerful company and mourned her husband and raised her children and fallen in love again with the deliberate honesty that was the hallmark of everything she did. And he thought that Harlan Voss had done him, in the end, the greatest possible favor by sending him south to Callow Creek with instructions to stop her. "So am I," he said. "Every day." She smiled, the full, real, rare smile that still, after 5 years, stopped his breath and looked back at her book. Outside, the Colorado night was clear and cold and full of stars, and the valley lay under them in its vast autumn quiet, its farms and its ditches and its fences and its families, all of it there and whole and exactly as it should be. Orville Granger put his pen down and looked out the window at the dark shapes of the mountains against the starred sky, and he thought, "This is it. This is the thing. This is what a life looks like when it is lived on the right side of the truth." He picked his pen back up and went on working, and Mamie turned a page, and the lamp burned steadily, and outside the window the valley breathed.